you. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I know that it's been a rough year and a rough past 2 weeks, so I'm grateful to all our panelists, attendees, and the NCPH organizers for devoting the time and energy and providing the space for having this conversation today. My name is Nicolette Kahn, and I'm a researcher and archivist at National Public Radio, and I'm privileged to be joined today by my colleague and fellow researcher at NPR, Colette Rosenberg, Alika Wali, curator of North American anthropology at the Field Museum, and Lena Mann, historian at the White House Historical Association. Colette and I reached out to Alika and Lena to hold this conversation because we were looking for examples of how archives, museums, and historical associations have been tackling the work of institutional self-reflection and self-examination to communicate history both to their public but also to their institutions. This is something that some of our team at NPR has been reckoning with, especially after the killing of George Floyd last May and the racial reckoning across the US and the world that followed. But of course, this work is not new. Many of our institutions and professions are steeped in whiteness, and curators, archivists, and historians, especially our colleagues of color, have been grappling with this throughout their careers. Both Alika and Lena have worked on projects that tell complicated stories about their institutions, and Colette and I are including our team in this conversation as an example of people who are just starting to embark on this work, so we hope that that resonates with some of you and you relate to that position as well. We're going to start with some brief presentations by each panelist so they can introduce themselves and ground us in their work, and then we'll move into a discussion. So please feel free to introduce yourselves and start sharing questions in the chat or Q&A box at any time. We hope to have a reserved time for Q&A at the end, but we also, of course, want to incorporate you into this discussion. But for now, I'll hand things off to Colette to start.
Great. Thanks so much, Nicolette. I'm really excited to be here today. And as Nicolette mentioned, my name is Colette Rosenberg, and I am a researcher and archivist at NPR. Before I get started, I just want to let you all know that throughout this presentation, I'm coming from my own point of view, not that of NPR's or my team's. So as Nicolette mentioned, we're looking at telling honest stories to build inclusive institutions. So ultimately, to better understand our own institutional history at NPR and to move forward honestly, we need to complicate our institutional narrative. And we can start doing that by making overlooked stories more accessible. For those of you who are not familiar with NPR, NPR is the National Public Radio. A very brief summary of NPR for you is that we are an independent nonprofit media organization. We're comprised of a network of member stations across the country. And on the screen here, you see a map of our member stations from the 1970s. If we go one slide further, we can show you what our member stations today look like. So it's kind of exciting. We get to partner with local newsrooms across the country, and our work has a broadcast, podcast, and digital component. And our content ultimately reaches millions of people every day. So I'm part of the Research, Archives, and Data Strategy team, also known as RAD. We support the NPR story from conception to preservation through fact-checking efforts and research to making sure a story's audio and transcript are preserved in our digital archive for future use and that they're accessible. So this year marks NPR's 50th anniversary, so it's definitely a very exciting time for us. And in a lot of ways, it's a very exciting time for us in particular at RAD, because in some ways we didn't really know if we'd still be here today. We were once the news library at NPR, and a lot of newsrooms phased out their libraries. So in some ways it's a bit rare for us to still exist in the way we do today. And it's exciting that NPR held onto its archive for as long as it did. So as the 50th has been coming up and we've been planning for it, we have been speaking about NPR's own coverage, NPR's own history internally, and talking to our colleagues. And in doing so, I've noticed that many of our colleagues and our journalists are disinterested in investigating our own institutional history and our own shortcomings. In some ways, this makes sense. History is not at the forefront of NPR's mission. The news is. And in a fast-paced, forward-thinking journalism outlet, it can feel like there's little room to grapple with kind of the questions around critical examination. But it's also a very exciting time for us as archivists when anniversaries come up, because archival audio is often drawn on, but certain voices, stories, and formats are often recycled during times of anniversaries and commemorations, such as kind of like the first broadcast or looking back at bloopers. And there's often little deviation from this over the years. So I want to play you a brief clip from All Things Considered's 8th anniversary, just to give you an idea of our programming during times of anniversaries.
Are 8. You can invite 8 people to your birthday party. When you're 9, you ask 9, etc. But in the All Things Considered family, many more than 8 people have taken part in today's birthday party, and we would like to name them for you. All the members of our present staff, the ones that you may not hear on the air, but who make possible everything that you do here.
They don't look any older, even if they might feel it. Here's the production staff. Maury Schlesinger, Neil Conan, Rick Lewis, Bob Siegel, Leslie Sewell, Mark Rosenbaum, Steve Reiner, Catherine Ferguson, Noah Adams, Jackie Judd,
Deborah Amos, Ann Gudenkopf, Joe McLeano, John Baer. We're going to turn 9 before this list is done. Rich Harris, Art Silverman, Leanne Hansen, Wendy Blair, Dee Clark, Christy Macy, Joanne Adams, and Alan Smith.
There's the engineering staff. Andy Rosenberg, Bob Knock, Leo Delacula, Lon Williams, Chet Hudson, Greg Hedgepath, John Stripe, Ralph Woods, Dale Niver, Eileen Griffin, Jude Franco, and Manoli Wetherill.
Bravo to all those people who were made possible by their mothers and fathers and funds from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Great. So I'm playing you that clip not because it engages with the work of critical examination, but it does do a really great job of making people's work and contributions more visible, even if they're not the names that are sort of well known. And that's something that we're going to touch on today. So through talking to colleagues about the 50th, it became apparent that we won't be able to change how journalists tell stories, but at RAD, we do have control over our archive and to some extent its interpretation. So with that, we have a responsibility to highlight content beyond All Things Considered or Morning Edition or other news magazines that we have. And we have a responsibility to highlight the history, the structures, and the key players behind that content. Ultimately, the people who had a lot of impact on our history, but are not the people necessarily considered known voices of NPR. So first, I want to kind of lay out how public history is different for RAD. This is really apt time for us to be engaging in this work. The fact that we're still here today makes it so that we have a 50-year continuous archive, which is an invaluable record of American history. And we believe that the work that RAD is doing to preserve and interpret this collection is public history. But what challenges our ability to engage in this work is that there's a sense of urgency. We're trying to create access to a lot of time-based and time-sensitive media, and interpretation isn't always at the forefront of that work. But what is unique about us is that we also don't have a direct line of communication to the public. Our archive is housed at the University of Maryland, and that archive is public-facing, but our archive at NPR is internal. So our audience is ultimately all of the people within NPR. But nevertheless, we're stewards of NPR history and we're storytellers. For example, our RAD historian, Julie Rogers, leads a session on the history of NPR for all of our new employees as part of their onboarding. And this past fall, I had the opportunity to work with Julie and my colleague, Julia Wall, to reimagine this onboarding session and explore how we might tell stories beyond what has been said and repeated about the founding and success of NPR. And through this work, I saw a clear shortcoming. Certain voices and narratives are more accessible than others in our archive, and therefore certain institutional stories are perpetuated or highlighted over others. So Julia and I became interested in looking to programs and content outside of NPR's dominant narrative, and that led us to exploring the Department of Specialized Audience Programming. So today we're going to look at how curating and making accessible programming from NPR's Department of Specialized Audience Programming, known as DSAP, addresses a lot of the shortcomings that we saw. It does this by centering figures and key players outside of the known NPR voices. So you might be familiar with Susan Stamberg or Terry Gross or Robert Siegel, but I'm going to introduce you to some other folks today. And it also illuminates a particular moment in our institutional history where we strove to build a better NPR and reach a more diverse audience. So we can think about, what does this content reveal about our ability or failure to do so? How does it parallel the moment we're in today, where we're also trying to diversify our audience and our reach? And how might we learn from these shortcomings to hold ourselves accountable and inform our current moment? So in 1974, NPR formally established DSAP, and to quote directly from the memo about DSAP, and again, this language and viewpoint might be a bit outdated, but to quote from the memo, the department was formed to foster new programming created about, by, and for special interest groups. Those groups which, by virtue of their ethnic or social identity, are subjected to the disadvantages inherent in a position of inequality in the American social structure. So DSAP ultimately produced thousands of hours of news coverage, interviews, documentaries, and cultural performances that served diverse audiences, including women, minorities, people with disabilities, and Spanish speakers. So several programming was produced, and a couple of them are highlighted here on the screen. I'm just going to play a short clip that incorporates audio from Enfoque Nacional, which was NPR's Spanish language news magazine that ran from 1979 to 1988. And you'll also hear excerpts from an oral history with one of the show's producers, Jose McMurray.
Enfoque Nacional was the model, in part because it was the only model for a well-done, professional, terrific news magazine for public broadcasting in Spanish.
Enfoque Nacional. Una recopilación semanal de noticias y entrevistas sobre nuestro diversificado pueblo de ascendencia hispana, sus avances, aspiraciones, inquietudes, descalabros, su cultura y en general su constante actividad en pro de un mejor futuro.
It was
very important that we were doing that, because it wasn't only just NPR that didn't have Latino. It was the Washington Post, the New York Times, even the Miami Herald didn't have that many Latinos in those days. You think back, well, that was only like 40 years ago, and that's how backwards the industry was. You know, you just didn't have minorities. We were opening roads for everybody.
Great. So as you may have gleaned from that clip, making this department and the stories behind it more accessible allows us to better understand ourselves and our institutional history. It allows us to also highlight key voices, journalists and producers who were integral to our history, yet are not as often part of the narrative we tell about NPR's history as a team. And Nicolette, if we could go to the next slide. Great. So DSAP was an incubator for talented journalists and documentarians. And on this slide are a few of the many people who contributed to this programming, some of which you may already know. So on the left, we have longtime NPR correspondent Richard Gonzalez. To the right, anchor, executive producer of Latino USA, Maria Hinojosa, and then late commentator Verda Mae Smart Grosvenor. And then to the far right, another key figure, Janet Dewart-Bell. Janet headed the department. She organized external workshops to support producers and reporters of color, oftentimes who were women, interfaced regularly with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting's Minority Task Force, and advocated for women and other minorities to hold influential positions throughout media and policymaking. So she ultimately had to frequently work with the CPB to negotiate grant funding allegations for specialized audience programs and really advocate for this work. So understanding this department and this history expands our understanding of who NPR considered to be the public at the time. It also challenges our assumption of kind of the assumed white audience that many media organizations had at the time. And instead, this department is reflective of a time in which people were making content for and trying to reach a different imagined audience, a different imagined public beyond the white, able-bodied, or straight public. Yet, something that I do want to point out is that by being sort of a specialized or diverse department and hub of programming, it kind of shows how this programming was sort of seen as like siloed from just sort of like programming that could be embedded within everything NPR did and reflective of all of America. So that is definitely a shortcoming I want to point out. And though we had aspirations to speak with many voices and reach all of America, we're kind of today grappling with the truth that, or the reality that our audience is predominantly white. And so in a lot of ways, this past parallels our current moment and efforts to reflect all of America on our sound waves. And through understanding this history, it could allow us to hold ourselves more accountable moving forward and to not hopefully repeat or reinforce past shortcomings. So ultimately, surfacing stories and centering the archive is really just the beginning. We need to interrogate how institutional memories and narratives are created and why certain stories and voices are upheld over others. Not only should we center the archive to critically examine our institutional history, but doing so should compel us to draw connections between past and present and critically examine our own journalistic coverage and the shortcomings within that coverage and content. Efforts to create a more whole archive should also inform our ability to tell more whole and more honest stories. And as I mentioned, that could start with our HR onboarding session but we could also begin to think about other spaces internally where we can do so. And ultimately, we want to we hope that this work really acknowledges the full weight and responsibility that we have as stewards of the archive and encourage others across the organization to similarly strive to tell honest stories about ourselves. For more stories and kind of resurfaced content, you can follow us on Twitter. And starting in May for our 50th anniversary, we'll be promoting content from the archives, including stories from DSEP programs. Yeah, so thank you all so much.
Hello. So my name is Lena Mann, and I work as a historian for the White House Historical Association. And I just want to say thank you for having me today to discuss this important topic about honest storytelling and building inclusive institutions. I think that this type of work is so important in public history, and I wanted to just share an example of one of the initiatives I am currently working on at the White House Historical Association that addresses this topic. So next slide. Just for a little background about what I do in my organization, the White House Historical Association is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, and we were founded in 1961 by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, and this year we are actually celebrating our 60th anniversary. So what better time than now to reevaluate and see what we can do to expand the stories we tell and to make our work and institution more inclusive. Next slide. So our mission at the association is to protect, preserve, and provide public access to the rich history of America's executive mansion. And we do this in a variety of ways. Next slide. So we participate in the preservation and restoration of the White House, and through our association, we have worked to fund various White House projects. We've also helped acquire new pieces of art for the White House collection. In addition to that, direct work with the White House, we have a publishing wing. We've started out with a guidebook with Jacqueline Kennedy way back in the day, and today we have expanded that to include a White House history journal, a number of books about different topics in White House history. And we are also known for producing the official White House Christmas ornament. It's one of our claims to fame. These are just fun. Our audience really enjoys them. They each tell a story of a different president or a moment in White House history. And then in my department, we focus on research, education, and our digital library. Next slide. So my organization, I work in the Rubenstein Center for White House History, and I work with a really fantastic team. So my direct colleague is Dr. Matthew Costello, and we do most of the history stuff, and we research, we write articles, we fill research requests internally and externally. And then we also have our education team and our digital librarians. Our educators work with teachers across the country to bring White House history to classrooms. And then we also have a digital library team. This is a fantastic resource filled with thousands of images of various aspects of White House history, lots of photographs. And then we, in my department, we've also worked to bring all of this research and history to the public. So now that you have a brief overview, I want to highlight a project that we in the Rubenstein Center have been working on over the past 3 years called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood, because it speaks to some of the new directions and new stories. And we can go to the next slide. So you might remember this powerful quote from First Lady Michelle Obama in 2016. She stated this first at an earlier speech, and then it really made big waves when she said it at the 2016 DNC convention. And this statement really prompted immediate fact checks by both conservative and liberal media outlets, and many turned to our website as the White House Historical Association for more information. But we didn't really have much of this information included. And it was certainly a blind spot for us. And for most of our history, the association, I would say, has focused more on a celebratory history, as many other historical institutions and museums have done. So we talk so much about what it is like for the president to live at the White House, first ladies, first families, even pets. But we don't necessarily cover thoroughly the lives of those many, many people that have worked for the White House, especially those enslaved at the White House. So we decided to try and address that problem. And we spent over 1.5 years researching slavery at the White House and developing content, including a series of research articles. Next slide. So in February 2020, we were able to pull all of this together, and we launched our web initiative, Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. Ultimately, the initiative tells the stories of the enslaved and free African Americans that built, lived, and worked at the White House. And we knew that, while there are often few written accounts of enslaved people's experiences, we can certainly draw on letters, newspapers, memoirs, census records, family histories, oral histories, architecture, really a variety of sources. And by connecting all of these details together, we have sought to return these individuals to the historical forefront by intertwining their stories with the lives of presidents, first ladies, and first families. So this is what the homepage of our initiative looks like. And we wanted to create this because we wanted to sort of expand our resources. Unlike the NPR archives or the Field Museum, we're not quite either of those institutions. We don't have archival holdings for the most part, nor do we operate a White House museum. So we're sort of a hybrid institution. And also, while we do have a digital library, when you're tracking enslaved people, that only has so much function because there really aren't that many photographs of enslaved people. But what we could do was we could produce new content and new research, and that is what we continue to work towards. So we know that slavery is, of course, a very important part of White House history, but also the broader history of our nation. And we chose to make it the president's neighborhood rather than just the White House to demonstrate how that affects many different aspects of life. And since many people think of the White House as this big symbol of democracy, we wanted to complicate that. It has a paradoxical relationship between slavery and freedom, and we wanted to sort of place it into that perspective. We know that enslaved people were involved in the construction of the White House and the operation of the home for much of the first half of the 19th century. And we know ultimately 9 presidents used enslaved labor at the White House, while 12 total presidents owned enslaved people at some point during their lives. Next slide. So our initiative has several features, and this is what you will also find on the homepage. We have an index of enslaved individuals, which includes over 200 names, and we hope to continue to add more. We have a section for frequently asked questions. We have a page with additional resources for those researching or for teachers and students that want more information. And then we also have a virtual tour of the slave quarters at Decatur House, which is the only known existing site of slavery within the site of the White House. And it's also where we have our offices. Next slide. So in addition to this, our initiative has our main feature is this interactive timeline, and I've included a couple screenshots from that timeline. So this portion of the website features just a number of articles about individuals, and it's in this timeline scrollable format. So you can click out to articles, or you can click on pop outs to learn more information about events in American history or in the history of slavery. And the intent with establishing this site was to create something interactive, but also something that would clearly present information. And we also wanted to make it something that you could read for a pretty wide and varied audience. So we have several elements of this. We have more general pieces that provide overview or tie into broader historical conversations. We also have household articles that are sort of the guideposts in terms of chronology. So those cover individual presidential households and enslavement. And then finally, we have individual stories. And this to me is sort of the heart of the initiative. Next slide. So telling the stories of enslaved people is really what I like doing most about this work. We wanted to center individual stories and make sure that these individuals are given their proper due. And here are just a few images of some of the individuals that you can find in the initiative. We have left to right, we have Paul Jennings. He wrote the very first White House memoir, and he detailed his time enslaved at the White House under James and Dolly Madison. And I would like to bring him up because I think he represents something that we're trying to do in that in his memoir, he relays the famous saving of the Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington. This is a very famous story that Dolly Madison single-handedly saved this portrait. But when you peel back the layers and look at what the people around her said, including an enslaved man like Paul Jennings, he indicates that it was enslaved and free White House workers that were directed by Dolly to save the painting. So this is an example of how we're trying to correct the narrative and add in more detail. Next, we have Elizabeth Keckley. She was a woman born into slavery. She gained her freedom and eventually became Mary Lincoln's seamstress and friend. The third photograph is a woman named Dolly Johnson. And in this photo, she is actually holding President Andrew Johnson's grandchild in this photograph. So she's really fascinating. And then we have last year, we have Elias Polk. He was an enslaved man in James K. Polk's White House. And once he gained his freedom, he actually had a really fascinating political career. So these stories are definitely my favorite part of doing this work, and they help to tell a more complete picture of White House history, while also working to combat previous falsehoods and just to provide more people with more information. I also want to add that I think it's important to note that those have worked on this project and who is behind all of this. So I personally started out as a graduate fellow from American University, and I started working on this project through that before I was hired on. And I just want to acknowledge that many of the people that have worked on this initiative have been other graduate fellows and interns. And I want to recognize their work here and recognize Callie Hopkins, Sarah Fling, Mia Owens, Tiana Mobley, Morgan Robinson, Jessica Brote, Penny Ferguson, and Lewis Keene. Each of these individuals has written articles for the initiative, and I think it's really wonderful to do public history work with other up-and-coming public historians because it's great to uplift younger scholars. And it's really important to me since I am a young career professional myself, and I want to uplift all of those coming behind me and really make these spaces more inclusive. Next slide. So that is sort of a brief overview of some of the steps that we are taking, but I also want to briefly mention some next steps. I always like to say that launching this initiative is just the first step and that there is so much more to do. We wanted to do the research first so that we had the background and could demonstrate to community partners, researchers, other historians, and also the general public that we are starting to do this work and that we're really committed to doing this work. And although COVID-19 happening just a month after launching this project has certainly slowed our next steps, things are starting to move forward now, and I'm really excited about a lot of things that we have in the works. So one thing I'm really passionate about is I want to work more with descendants. We haven't really established those relationships yet, and a lot of other presidential sites have already started doing this work. For example, Montpelier has been closely working with descendants for many years, and we hope to start doing stuff like this, but also acknowledge that it really takes time to build those relationships. And we have had some descendants reach out to us since this initiative started. We do have a public email line for the project, and so we allow people to email us if they have, concerns, questions, suggestions, or their own family stories that they want included. Those have been really great. I'm meeting with a family next week that is a descendant family, and it's really great to establish those connections, and I hope to continue to grow that. And we also are continuing our research. So we're still developing new content, or we're updating updating as we get more information, and we want to keep current. And I think one of the major benefits of a digital project is this ability to update. So for example, we've made very intentional and conscious language choices, like using the term enslaved over slave wherever possible. We want to make sure that we're up to date and as respectful as possible. And we also keep tuned into current events. And I think the last year has allowed us to make a lot of connections to the present. For example, this summer, a lot of publications started capitalizing Black throughout their publications, and we have also decided to adopt that and went back and updated a lot of our stuff as well. So we want to keep engaged with those trends. And then finally, I think that structural parity is really important. I think that in most institutions need to tackle this. Museums and historical institutions, of course, have historically tended to be white spaces, and increasing diversity within our institution is also vital and something I hope we will continue to work towards. So thank you, and looking forward to answering some questions later.
Wow, great presentations. Thank you so much. And thank you, Colette and Nicolette, for reaching out to me to be part of this panel. My name is Alaka Wali, and I'm an anthropologist. I've been working at the Field Museum for about 25 years now. I'm the curator of North American anthropology. And I'd like to start by recognizing that the Field, as the Field Museum does, that we recognize that we are guests on Native land. We are on the traditional homelands of the Potawatomi people, but also the Ho-Chunk, the Missouri, the Iowa, the Otoe, the Miamia, the Inoka, the Kickapoo, the Menominee, the Ojibwe, the Meskwaki, the Sauk, and the Odawa. So as you know, Chicago was this great crossroads even before settlers came, and we respect all of the original peoples who lived here. And we continue to honor also the urban Native population who have been great collaborators with the Field Museum. So with that, I'd like to start. I'm going to talk about a specific case at the Field Museum that I worked on as curator of the North American collection, providing a different perspective, I think, from the ones that you've heard today, but I think resonating with those. And this is the case of the Malvina Hoffman sculptures. So the next slide, please. The Field Museum, as so many of you may already be familiar with, is an institution that has been around since it has its roots in the World Columbian Exposition of 1893. And that's where the original collection of the Field Museum was started. But eventually that became housed in this building, which was opened in 1921. And the museum is considered one of the large natural history museums of the world, with its collection of over 40 million specimens and cultural resource items. So it's a major institution. Next slide. And as you can see, the Field Museum is deeply problematic from the perspective of a colonialist perspective. It's embodied in this architecture of colonialism, from the facade that you saw with the Greek columns to these interior spaces that just sort of speak to the notion that was prevalent at the time of its founding, that museums should be temples, right? That they should be authoritative in their voice and how they speak to the so-called masses that were coming through. If you can imagine, in the 1920s, the immigrant populations of Chicago that were encouraged to come visit these civic institutions, the Art Institute, the Field Museum, and thereby become educated, in quotes, and so on. So that kind of legacy of colonialism is steeped into everything that the Field Museum represents. So when we think about how we problematize this and reflect on it, it's like very hard to think of how you do that within this particular setting. So let's go to the next slide. The story I want to tell about how we tried to do that. Next slide, please. We're going to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm following along on my own screen and I'm not seeing your screen. I'll put that up. So, sorry, can you go back one slide to the one, that one? Sorry about that. So this is Malvina Hoffman, and I want to tell her story because it kind of is emblematic of this dilemma that we face when we think about what do we do with both the problematic history of our collection and what are we going to do to transform how we can use that collection. Malvina Hoffman was an artist. She was the last student of Auguste Rodin, and she was commissioned in 1930 by Stanley Field, who was the director of the museum at the time, to create a series of sculptures that the anthropology curators wanted to showcase in the new exhibition for the next World's Fair, the 1933 World's Fair, which was called the Century of Progress. And they wanted to have an exhibition that started by talking about human evolution, but then moved on in a separate hall to talking about the so-called races of mankind. And the curators and Stanley Field both thought that art, using art, was a dynamic and innovative way to convey these scientific, so-called scientific ideas that they wanted to expound on in their in the museum in these two new halls. And so Stanley Field had heard of Malvina Hoffman, who was then based in New York, and he went to see her and to talk to her about doing this, making these sculptures for this hall called the Races of Mankind. And the anthropology curators, they were interested in depicting what was then in the 1930s, late 1920s, the sort of prevalent thinking around the concept of race and racial types, right? And I don't want to go into detail here on that, but this was the time that eugenics was very popular in the scientific community, and also this whole, what I call the pseudoscience of race, the notion that there are biological determinants of physical variation that can be categorized into these different so-called races. And so that thinking, although countered by some anthropologists like Franz Boas, was still very prevalent in this time. And the curators at the Field Museum, they had their own perspective on race in which they subdivided the major racial types into these 104, 108 subtypes of physical variation. And they asked Malvina Hoffman to create plaster casts of what they called these idealized types of racial variation. Now, Malvina, she was not into plaster. She was into bronze. She had been a student of Rodin, as I said, and she wanted to make bronze sculptures for this exhibition. And she talked Stanley Field into doing that, to letting her do that instead of making the plaster casts that the anthropologists wanted. She was allowed to make and given the funds to make these bronze sculptures. And in order to meet the demands of the anthropologists as to finding the various racial types, she traveled the world and especially Asia, and she had a studio in Paris to take casts of real people, both from real life and then also from photographs. Okay, now the next slide. And that exhibition was installed in 1933 at the opening. So it's pretty remarkable that Malvina Hoffman was able to create, in the end, she created 104 sculptures, busts and full figure sculptures, including this sort of centerpiece that was in the exhibition, which she called the Unity of Mankind. And it has these 4 figures representing the so-called 4 races holding up the globe. And it was this exhibition opened, as I said, in this 1933, but was popular during the entire time that it was at the Field Museum, and was visited by I think over 10 million people during that time. Next slide. And this, I'm just wanting to show you some of the bronze sculptures that she made. And some of them, about 39 of them, were full figure sculptures. This is one of a young man from the Nuer people. And then this is a woman from the Burmese, I think it's Burma, Padwan people. Beautiful. I mean, I think why these sculptures were popular is because this was Malvina Hoffman's artistry. She's little known, you know, as a woman sculptor, sort of working in these kinds of major sculpting traditions. Some of her work is public art that was outside. And so, you know, she's not recognized or given credit for her artistry the way I think she should have been given. But I think part of the popularity of this exhibition in the time that it was up has to do with the sheer compelling nature of the portraits that she was making. But also then, next slide. Her sculptures were used in these kind of spin-off products, in, like, for example, this map that was created by the Hammond Atlas Company. And that sort of popularized her sculptures, or took them beyond the museum and into the realm of the public. And so if you can see in this slide, you know, what they did was, here's all the people from, you know, each of the continents, and they highlight where they come from in this sort of framing around the map of the world. So the story here that I want to tell is that the poet in 1966, 67, I think, about then, the African-American poet Amiri Baraka, or Leroy Jones, who changed his name to Amiri Baraka, saw this map and was highly offended by the depiction of peoples from non-Western peoples from around the world in this way. And he wrote a letter to the Field Museum, basically saying, this is really racist and despicable, and you ought to stop using these sculptures to, you know, further the racism inherent in the way that non-Western peoples are portrayed. I'm paraphrasing his letter. But the letter is in our archives, and I think we put parts of it in the exhibition. I'll show you. Anyway, the letter from Amiri Baraka came at a time when the curators, then curators in the 1960s, were already rethinking this exhibition, given the civil rights movements that were going on in the 1960s, the whole reconsideration of race and the fact that anthropologists themselves had considerably changed their views on the way that biology was being used to characterize physical variation. It was becoming evident more and more that what was considered so-called the science of race was actually a pseudoscience, and that in fact physical variation could not be characterized into these groups or types, and that human genetic distribution, there's more in common among all of us than there is division, and that you can't classify on the basis of physical variation people into these groups. So that was becoming very clear by the 1960s. And so at that time, the museum, I have one more, made the decision to install this exhibition. Next slide, please. And here you can see this. This was a chart that was up in the exhibition, and it shows the kind of then pseudoscience of race and how these categories end up basically reinforcing the notion that somehow Nordic peoples or so-called, Nordic peoples are at the top of the hierarchy. And so this kind of racial thinking by the 1960s, anthropology was starting to understand that we were complicit in the perpetuation of these racist ideas. And so we're beginning to counter that. And so the exhibition was deinstalled. Next slide. And the sculptures, because they had been so popular and because they were so beautiful, I think, as pieces of art, were then scattered around the museum as kind of and used to decorate the halls and hallways. And so they stood among these plants, or as the museum changed, they were just kind of left, and often without any kind of labels or protection. And in fact, a lot of them became damaged over the years because people love to go up and touch them and rub the sculptures. And so you get these wearing of the patinas. And eventually when I became curator, we started taking them off exhibit altogether to protect them. And I kind of requested to adopt these sculptures into the North American collection because I felt that there was a story here about the Field Museum, about the way we had dealt with or not dealt with the concepts of race, and that it would be at some point interesting to think about how we could further use these sculptures to tell that story instead of the story for which they had been originally created. And 50 years after the deinstallation of the original exhibit, next slide, please, we were able to do that. And we created a new exhibit that opened in 2016 called Looking at Ourselves, Rethinking the Sculptures of Malvina Hoffman. Some people had argued, some people within the museum, that we should deaccession the sculptures altogether because of what was the point of holding on to what were pieces of art when we were a natural history museum? Why would we do that? And sort of thinking around that, like there was no use for these sculptures at our museum, but I felt that they did tell a story that we should be telling, which was a story about the way that a museum has thought about race. And so this exhibition that we then created, next slide, please, we tried to do just that. Instead of an exhibit that was about race itself, it was an exhibit, what we created here was an exhibit that is about how field museum and anthropological thinking about race has changed, but has it really changed? In order to do that, we first did have to restore the sculptures, and to do that, the conservation team did a huge amount of research to look into how Malvina Hoffman created, for example, the patinas, that she paid very careful attention to detail in terms of color palette and so on. So it's a very fascinating story in and of itself there. Next slide, please. We, in the new installation of the Hoffman sculptures, we arranged it to show 3 different aspects of how we could think about repurposing these sculptures. So in the first section of the exhibit, we talk about we critique the biology of race. And we use just the bust for the most part. We use about half of the 104 in the new exhibition. And I use the bust to talk about biology because there's less of the kind of ethnographic markers of these people. And the focus is on phenotype, on the physical features. You can see here that there's a panel in the middle, which is a graphic static panel. And then there's this digital rail in front of here, a digital panel, which allows us to provide more information about the whole concept of race and as we understand it today. Next slide. And so in our standing panel, static panel, if you will, we wanted our audience to really understand that while scientists have discarded, by and large, the notion that physical variation in humanity can be categorized into racial types, it does not mean that racism has disappeared or that the idea of race has therefore been discarded. And so we tried to capture that in this label. And by these photographs, at the time we put up the exhibit was right around the time of Ferguson, Missouri, and the protests around the killings there by the police. It was kind of the beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement and protests also by Native peoples about being a mascot, so all of this ferment around the representation of race was going on, and we tried to capture that here to link that kind of protest and thinking around an activism which had led to the initial de-installment to the ongoing activism today. Next slide. So then we used the second section of the exhibit. We had the display of the full figure sculptures that Malvina had created. And our team had been able to do, Malvina left an extensive archive of photographs and journal notes. And so we had a lot of information, not complete by any means, about who these people were and what was distinctive about Malvina. What she did was she subverted, she was very subversive with the anthropologists. They wanted composite types. They had given her measurements of noses and eyes and stuff that they wanted, and she totally discarded that. And she made these sculptures into portraits of real people. So each one of these is a real person, some of whom we knew the names of from her notes. And so we were able to add the names of these people here and tell their stories in the exhibition rather than talk about types. And in this section, we also talked about that, that you can explain human variation, both physical and cultural, without the concept of race, without categorizing people into racial types. Next slide. So this this is a slide, this is a label that in which we tried to capture that idea that our behavior isn't defined by how we look. The notion that you can tie cultural behavior to physical variation, that's what's so pernicious about racism and the way that race is used, right? That people who look different must be different in the way that they behave as well. And some are inferior to others, and so thereby justifying discrimination. So we try to come that false notion of categorization. Next slide. And then in the third section of the exhibition, we talk about Malvina Hoffman herself and how she came to see, she was also not immune to the notions of pseudoscience and racism, but she also overcame some of those. She was a complex person and there were many contradictory ideas that informed the way that she made these sculptures. But coming into contact with people as she traveled, as you can see in this quote from her, she started to see them as they were, if you will, rather than as types. And I think part of why personally I felt that we could display these sculptures and retell the story or tell the story in another way, the story of race in another way, is because of her art, because she made these sculptures in such a compelling form that they speak to you, and they've spoken to visitors over the years and in the new exhibit also on many different levels, and not just about this notion of race per se, but about the beauty of human cultural diversity, human physical diversity, and the dignity of people. Almost all of the sculptures, people are presented as dignified, as beautiful. She loved the human body, and she wanted to showcase the human form at its best. And I think some of that is why we were able to continue to have the sculptures and not store them away and be ashamed of them, but use them to really talk about the complexities of race in our time and her time. So yeah, that's the story about repurposing a problematic collection. Thank you.
Thank you, Alika and Lena and Colette, for grounding us in some of the work that you've been doing. It's really fascinating to hear about just the variety of projects that we've worked on, and kind of taking off from what you were just talking about, Alika, with Malvina's art. Each of our institutions plays a role in storytelling and collective memory, but we also have very different institutions and different kinds of collections. So I was wondering if you could each speak a little bit about what unique storytelling capacity your collections have.
I can start. I think that one of the cool things for us is that we actually do have a lack of collections in this capacity. In a weird way, it sort of gives us a blank canvas to work with. And I think that, now that we've done a bunch of these articles. We want to move forward with making more connections with community members, potential descendants. It sort of feels like we could build our own collection in a way. I think that is really cool, and something I'm hoping that people have family documents, et cetera, that they will eventually bring forward and that we can digitize and share with the public. So I kind of see a potential for building collections moving forward, since we don't necessarily have them.
I mean, I could say that almost all the cultural collections at the Field Museum are problematic just because of the way they were collected, and not everything was, some things were purchased, obviously, and so on. But nevertheless, the intent behind the collection, the vast majority of the anthropological collections, was to do this work of categorizing people and sort of enshrining them in some kind of ahistorical moment. And so to tell stories that make sense today is problematic, is challenging. And so, but as I've just tried to say with the Malvina sculptures, what are the pieces themselves, the things in our collection are so powerful. There's theories in anthropology that say that objects have agency, and I think there's a validity to that. They speak to people. They don't just sit there on static. They have a dynamic power. So you want to activate that power in the best way you can and use the collection to tell contemporary stories. The way we've tried to do that, the Malvina Hoffman one, I did not have any co-curators, and I'm rethinking how come I didn't at that point. But the Native American collection that we're now using, and we're renovating the Native American Hall, that one is a complete collaboration with over 100 Native storytellers are going to be telling stories of from using the collections to talk about both the past and the present and the future. And so that's a very different way of approaching the use of our collections.
Yeah, I think something that I would say is with Alika, your work, I feel like in some ways it feels a little bit parallel to, I guess, how I conceptualize our archive, where you mentioned sort of like these sculptures in some ways being a story of how racial attitudes and understandings of race changed over time. And I think at NPR, I mentioned this a little bit, but just having kind of like this 50-year continuous archive, I see it as a collection that in some ways kind of tells the story of how like collective memory or the collective consciousness within our country has or kind of like social attitudes have changed over time. And I think that is something that I see in terms of like a potential for storytelling within that collection. I think it could be one day, maybe if we kind of push our journalists and our colleagues internally to kind of like use that archive as a site to kind of examine whiteness and examine how journalism has like in some ways upheld white supremacy and worked to tell certain people's stories and kind of like silence other people's narratives. So I think that's definitely a potential I see is, I guess, within RAD and within our team, kind of enabling the newsroom to embark on kind of like this journey of critical examination and storytelling.
Yeah, I agree with you. I saw that parallel too. I mean, because what you have this incredible resource, and so how can you use it to reflect on ourselves as an institution? And in the case of the Malvina Hoffman, I came to the Field Museum in 1995, and at that time we were very reluctant. The museum was very reluctant to talk about itself, as you say, Colette, in the sense of like, oh no, There was an exhibition we did where they didn't even want me to use the word colonialism. As they said, our publics won't understand it. They don't know what that means. So, but things have changed. Times have changed and over the years. And so, by the time we put up this new Malvina Hoffman exhibit, the museum was willing to examine itself and to talk about its complicity. And it got a lot of favorable press for doing that. So that was really encouraging. We had articles about this exhibit in the New York Times, for example, and so on. So I think that encouraged the museum to say, yeah, we can do this. We can talk about ourselves and reflect on our history and, and not be afraid to do that. So, yeah. It sounds like Lena, you're doing that as well with the White House. That's so fascinating.
We're trying, yeah. Slow steps, but we're working on it.
That kind of transitions into one of the questions that came from one of the attendees, Jamie Clark, and they were asking if you can speak about any pushback that you got from the audience when inclusive perspectives have been introduced in your work and how you met that pushback. And I'd also like to hear not just about from audience, but also how you got buy-in internally as well for this work.
I feel like overall from the public, it's been a better reception than I anticipated. And I think that it's only gotten better as this year has gone on, and these issues have really come to light in the public in a very different way. I think that there's a big cultural shift, and now a lot of people are talking about race in a way that they weren't before, and I think that that's really positive. I will say that it's not across the board necessarily. We still do get plenty of pushback, particularly on social media. We have, I think, an older audience. So I think that there are certainly people that leave comments when we promote this Slavery in the President's Neighborhood project, like, oh, why do we have to talk about this? Why can't we talk about dogs, White House dogs, or, Christmas? And it's like, we can talk about all of those things, but we just have to balance it. And not all historical moments are positive. And I think that it shouldn't be an issue to incorporate those harder stories in with some of the more fun content.
Yeah, we got interestingly, as I said, mostly positive responses from the media and the public to the exhibition. But there was one prominent culture critic, if you will, who wrote an article in I think it was the Wall Street Journal, where he basically trashed the exhibition. And he said that why is the Field Museum beating up on itself? Those people, those curators in that time, they were just, it was the same old thing you hear. They were just products of their time. That was the way we thought about race. And, so there was that kind of pushback, which we basically decided we didn't want to respond to. But then there was also been pushback from folks in the, on the other side, who feel that despite this attempt to sort of contextualize and use the sculptures to talk about the problem of racial, race thinking, that the sculptures themselves are never going to be unproblematic, and that somehow just even putting them out is still privileging a Western gaze on non-Western people, and that, we'll never get over that history. So that's, that was another pushback. And some very constructive ideas, suggestions came from other people who also had that criticism, but felt that the exhibition was worth having. And so we rearranged some things to better address some of those critiques in the exhibition. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear about. And I guess when I think about this question, it feels like there are two parts of it potentially for NPR, or at least the work that Nicolette and I do, just because, as I mentioned, like our audience technically within RAD is an internal facing audience. So I think in some ways, kind of the pushback we've received with this work of critical examination is that there's been sort of like little buy-in from the newsroom to kind of embark on this work. And it's kind of this irony because I think NPR is really great at critical examination, and you kind of see that play out every day. And specifically too, like within our podcasts and kind of the great work that those teams do in particular. And I think that there is sort of like a hunger for this work internally, but I think kind of, again, it ties back to this, I guess, like the institutional stories within kind of a journalism outlet where we're seen as being, you know, part of a super fast-paced environment, and that journalism should be like forward thinking, or it should be kind of like this objective record of the present. So I think in some ways, and Nicolette and I grappled with this when kind of thinking about this presentation, it feels like there needs to be sort of like a restructuring of how we kind of like conceptualize what journalism really is, and thinking about how in some ways, like you cannot escape the biases and the power structures that are embedded within storytelling. But kind of thinking too about what both of you had mentioned in terms of pushback from like the public at large, what also feels very relevant to me is that a lot of media organizations have been embarking on the work of, you know, looking back at their past shortcomings and kind of scrutinizing their own coverage. And I think what's become clear is that it's really important to do that work, but that also needs to come with very like concrete material changes happening inside of our newsrooms and inside of our organizations. And in some ways you sort of just risk replicating, kind of like capitalizing off of, you know, diversity or tokenizing diversity. And so I think within like the reckoning that's happened across newsrooms in this country, like it's really important to kind of ground it into or in these kind of like concrete structural changes that really need to happen too.
Shifting gears a little bit, something that struck me was how much the idea of the individual and the individual story came up during all three presentations, which was really cool. But something, again, that Colette and I grappled with a little bit in our work is how to bring out these stories and tell more of these stories without tokenizing that individual or stripping them of their agency, sort of by telling that story out of context. Or how do you give that story its, you know, original context?
Yeah, it's challenging. It's you know, I think we didn't do a great, I mean, it's very hard in an exhibition format. It's a lot, I think, you know, you can provide more in-depth information in a web format, or, you know, obviously in a book, whatever, but an exhibition, you're limited, as you saw in those label copy that I was showing you, you know, 70 words is what we're told max in a label. You know, and so how you balance these complexities of something like a Melvina Hoffman was a very complicated person. You know, as I said, she's a woman struggling to, you know, establish a reputation in a male field. You know, to do this 104 sculptures, you know, busts and full figures in 3 years, you know, is incredible. Is it just, you know, every time we think about it, and to have paid so much attention to detail in doing it. She didn't just, you know, throw something together here. this remarkable feat of accomplishment. And yet it was for this, cause that was really horrible, so how do you get that contradictions and complexities across is not in one story is challenging. So yeah, I don't have any answers.
To complicate it a little bit, I think for us, obviously don't want to tokenize, but also a lot of the stories that we do have are pretty sparse in detail. I only have sometimes a name of somebody, and I don't have any other identifying, especially for individuals that built the White House. I have a lot of first names and I have no last names. So that makes it really difficult to tell a complete story. And I think that is an additional challenge. It's not necessarily, it becomes like whether I can tell a story at all and put it into words. So I think that it is really, really helpful when I do have certain narratives and memoirs written by enslaved people. That helps me get a better sense of what their lives and every day was like. But a lot of it is just piecing together very sparse details and trying to fill in gaps. So I think that you just have to pay a lot of attention, and you also have to approach things from different angles. Sometimes the research just isn't there, or the source you need just isn't there. So you have to think of other ways to approach and to bring these narratives forward.
Yeah, I think that idea of kind of, Lena, that you had mentioned in terms of like really relying on kind of like the work and the writing of enslaved people themselves, I think it kind of just reminds me of something that feels like undervalued in the work that we do, but really important in terms of like oral history work. And I played like a short clip of Jose McMurray, who had worked on Enfoque Nacional. But I think in some ways, I feel like just hearing about his own experience working on the program, being able to hear he himself sort of like complicate narrative, I think that is like super crucial. And I hope that is something that moving forward, we can kind of value more internally as an institution in terms of like hearing actually from the people who worked on these shows, who produced this content. Oftentimes like the invisible labor behind this work, I think is really important. And I also think too, what our historian Julie Rogers does a really good job of is sort of like grounding these individuals in the context in which they were working, or kind of like the complexities of like the society around them at the time. And I think to me that also feels sort of crucial. I definitely had moments of looking in our archive and being like, oh, whoa, this person worked on this, that must mean this. And then Julie kind of was able to step in and be like, well, it was even, it was so cool that they were even able to push this program forward at all. So it's really not that story. So I think that is really helpful.
We started to touch on this a little bit, and it echoed something that Alaka had said in her presentation about, the museum being almost this like inescapable place of colonialism just because of the way it's structured. And I feel like obviously we're all still grappling with the structures that we operate in, maintaining, some level of whiteness or colonialist even, but have you found ways, for example, like Lena working in like a digital space, like with using new technology or new spaces or new methods that have helped kind of combat that and meet people more where they're at?
Yeah, I think I actually think that one of the advantages for an institution like ours is that we were already pretty digitally based prior to COVID. And this actually served as a little bit of an opportunity for us to really expand our virtual programming and to bring these stories out. And we've, since the pandemic started, we've been running a program called White House History Live, where we've brought in, authors that have recent books, but also bringing some of this research about slavery into discussion. And that's been really valuable valuable, and we've had a lot of engagement on those topics. Those have been some of our most popular programs. So that indicates to me that the public is really hungry for this information. And, you know, it's really cool to me because I've been working on this for a couple years now. And, you know, I didn't really get a ton of buy-in, but after this year, I've seen a lot more interest. So both internally and externally as well. So I think that that's really, really cool.
Now, unfortunately, we're behind in terms of our digital presence, I think, at the Field Museum. But when I came to the museum, you know, it was not that easy to change things inside the walls of the museum, as I mentioned. So what I started to do was work with community organizations outside the museum and sort of to bring the research expertise, you know, because we're not just a collection, we also have faculties, curators, collection staff, et cetera, to collaborate with community organizations in Chicago initially, and to really sort of find ways in which the research and sort of the communication specialties of our museum, you know, could be shared with community organizations. So we started doing a lot of that kind of work. I don't like to call it outreach, but like community engagement work outside of the museum. And that, I think, has had a lot more impact on, you know, what we can do to decolonize and, you know, sort of start really addressing the issues of, you know, being a powerful institution and decentering authority, all those kinds of tropes that, you know, we've been trying to work on as a museum community. I think a lot of museums are finding innovative ways right now. It's a good time because museums are changing and thinking, and I think archives are also. So it's exciting, I think, to see a lot of different ways in which people are trying to transform practice.
Yeah, I think something that comes to mind kind of within the work we've been doing at NPR is, again, like thinking about what tools or what spaces do we have ownership over as a team, and how can we sort of like push forward this work even when maybe there isn't buy-in. And so I guess one thing that I think of is our team has recently been resurfacing archival audio content on and publishing it to npr.org. And that's been a workflow that we've been able to have like complete control over. We don't have to go through the newsroom or, you know, editors, and we're able to create our own headlines and teasers. And we haven't necessarily experimented much with sort of resurfacing content that we kind of then want to like retell the story of, if that makes sense. But I think that's definitely something that we can think about. And I've already kind of flagged a few stories, or as a team, we've flagged a lot of stories that are, you know, problematic and that we need to revisit and we need to learn from. And I think there's opportunity to kind of like take ownership over that workflow and push those stories forward so that we can engage the public and kind of like have these difficult conversations. So hopefully that's something that we do more of in the future.
Very cool. I want to see some of those old radio stories retold. I think that would be great.
Yeah, we have a whole Trello board for you.
Piggybacking off of that a little bit, I know that both, at least for RAD and for White House Historical Association, and I'm assuming also for you all, like you have, you know, day-to-day research that you're supposed to be working on. How do you kind of advocate for resources for doing this kind of what's initially seen as extra work?
That's also a really good question. I think it's really interesting because for me, I started out as a research fellow. So I was like fully grounded in this project and this work for a lot of my time at the association. But when I came on board full time last spring as a historian, that sort of expanded my scope. You know, I was no longer only focusing on this initiative. And so now I have to balance, you know, I want to keep this going, but balance a bunch of other responsibilities as well. And, you know, we do tell the full history of the White House, which includes, you know, 200 years of other events that don't include this initiative. So it is like a very delicate balancing act for me personally. But I always like to advocate I think it's really cool. And I think that using this slavery initiative as a jumping off point, I think that there's other aspects of White House history that I hope to cover in the future. You know, like I really want to take a look more at the working White House. You know, there's tons of people and tons of stories that have yet to be told in that category. So I feel like I just keep building, and it might be slow, but I think it is really cool to see over time. And another thing I want to mention is that, you know, funding is a big problem behind this. So, you know, I think that our institutions are probably pretty lucky. I think that there's probably a lot of money flowing through all three of us. But I think that for smaller institutions, it can be really challenging to spark these initiatives. You know, it did cost us money to create this website and we had to spend a lot of time and energy. So that's just something to think about, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think funding for us too can be totally an issue in the sense that a lot of the work we do, we have kind of like a lot of tasks in terms of like research and sort of like audio ingest and definitely archival work, but sort of like the deeper dives into the archive often rely on grant funding. And so in that sense, it can be challenging to push these projects forward. But I guess something that I think we've realized as a team is being able within our workspace to sort of like advocate for a project and point to, I guess in some ways, like holding like leadership accountable in terms of like, okay, if you're laying out these like cultural pillars for us as an organization and you say kind of like, you know, diversity and equity are like really core, then kind of like, I guess, pushing back and saying, well, then this work should be at the forefront of what we're doing. And it's really not sort of something that should be seen as like extra work or extraneous to like our mission. Like it really is at the core of our mission. And I think that's also been something that we've been trying to do as a team, is not just like think about this work in terms of like one-off projects or yeah, I guess project-based, but really like how can we like in our everyday think about this, even if it's sort of like we're resurfacing audio from the 1970s and the language used in that audio is something that we really need to address with the content warning or something to kind of make it clear that we do have a responsibility when we are working with this content.
Yeah. I agree with all of that. Funding challenges and finding the time to do it and balancing that time with research, publishing, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I think you're right, Colette, that this should be central to the work, you know. If we're gonna walk the walk, then it should be. So
I also would add that you know, when I first started 3-4 years ago, that I don't think that the project that we've executed and conceived existed at the time. And I think that you know, as you bring in new people with new ideas, a lot of this does become more central to and address those core missions. And yes, I think it is definitely a part of it and should be seen as central moving forward.
Yeah, definitely. One of the points we wanted to kind of make as an underlying point is, you know, if you have a more diverse workforce, if you support diversity at your institution, then these stories will naturally take priority because you have, a better diversity of viewpoints at your institution. We only have 1 minute left. I want to thank everyone again so much for joining in this conversation. It's been really inspiring, and that's why Colette and I wanted to talk with you both. And so it makes me excited to think about our next steps, and I look forward to following both of your work too.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was really
Thank
great.
you.
Fun.
Thanks, everyone.